I didn't know then that the smallest decisions, like agreeing to one more tutoring session, could quietly rearrange your entire life. Looking back, it feels obvious, the way a memory does when it finally admits what it was always trying to become. At the time, though, I told myself I was just there to study. Nothing more. Nothing dangerous. I've always been the kind of person who likes structure. Lists, timetables, clear expectations. I study early in the morning, drink my coffee black, underline important sentences twice. I like knowing where I'm going. Or at least I did before him. Before the afternoons that stretched longer than planned. Before the moments that refused to stay academic. I met Daniel through the university's tutoring program during my second year. He was a few years older, already finished with his degree, calm in a way I wasn't. Where I rushed through explanations, he slowed everything down. Where I panicked over grades, he reminded me that learning wasn't a race. On paper, he was just my tutor for an advanced economics course I was barely surviving. In reality, he became something else entirely. Something I didn't have a name for yet. Our sessions usually took place in a quiet study room on the top floor of the library. Tall windows, afternoon light, the low hum of air conditioning. Daniel always arrived 5 minutes early, notebooks neatly stacked, sleeves rolled just enough to reveal his forearms. I noticed things like that before I noticed anything else. The way he listened, really listened, when I spoke. The way he smiled before correcting me, as if he didn't want knowledge to feel like failure. I told myself I admired him. That was safe. Admiration didn't ask questions late at night. He learned my habits quickly. Knew when I'd had too much caffeine, when I was lying about understanding a concept. He teased me about my handwriting, called it aggressively determined. I teased him back about his color-coded notes. It was easy, comfortable, and somewhere in that comfort, something quietly shifted. The day everything began to feel different wasn't dramatic. No big announcement, no obvious sign, just an email from Daniel suggesting we move our next session off campus. "The library's packed," he wrote. "There's a quiet place near my apartment. Better focus." I stared at the message longer than necessary, my chest tight for reasons that had nothing to do with studying. I told myself yes before I could overthink it. His apartment was simple, clean, sunlight spilling across wooden floors, a faint scent of coffee and something citrusy that I'd later come to associate with calm, and with him. He apologized for the mess even though there wasn't any. I sat at his small dining table, books spread between us, our knees close enough that I became hyper-aware of every movement. We started like always, notes, graphs, explanations, but the air felt different, thicker somehow. When he leaned over to point at a formula, his shoulder brushed mine. Just once. Accidental. Harmless. Except my pulse reacted like it had been waiting for permission. I hated how much I noticed him then. The quiet concentration on his face. The way his voice softened when I struggled. The way he said my name like it mattered. I found myself holding on to small details. How he stirred sugar into his coffee. How he pushed his chair back with his foot. As if memorizing him without admitting why. I went there to study. That's the truth I clung to. But somewhere between borrowed pens and shared silences, I realized I wasn't just learning economics anymore. I was learning how it felt to want something I hadn't planned for, and to be terrified that he might see it written all over my face. If someone had asked me when Daniel stopped being just my tutor, I wouldn't have been able to answer. There was no clear moment where a line was crossed. It was more like waking up one day and realizing the room looked different because the light had shifted, quietly, without permission. Our sessions became a regular thing after that first afternoon at his apartment. Once a week turned into twice, sometimes 3 times when exams crept closer. I told myself it was necessity. Daniel joked that I was single-handedly keeping the tutoring program alive, and I laughed louder than the joke deserved. What made our connection different wasn't just the studying. It was everything that happened around it. He remembered small things, how I liked my coffee strong, how I got quieter when I was overwhelmed, how I tapped my pen against the table when I was pretending to understand something I didn't. I started noticing his habits too. How he always sat on the same side of the table. How he leaned back and crossed his arms when he was thinking. How he tilted his head slightly when he was amused, like he was deciding whether to tease me or let me win the moment. "You're overthinking again," he said one afternoon, tapping the page gently with his pen. "I'm not," I replied automatically. He raised an eyebrow. "You just sighed at a graph. That graph deserved it." He laughed then, quiet, warm, and something in my chest loosened. Those were the moments I lived for without admitting it. The easy banter. The feeling that I wasn't being judged or rushed. That I could be exactly as confused or confident as I needed to be. We developed inside jokes without trying. I called one particularly difficult formula the betrayal, and Daniel never referred to it by its real name again. He started challenging me to explain concepts back to him, pretending to misunderstand on purpose just to see if I'd catch it. When I did, he looked genuinely proud, like my progress mattered beyond grades. Sometimes our sessions ran long. Not because we needed more time, but because neither of us was eager to say goodbye. We'd drift into conversations about everything else. Music, travel plans that never quite formed, childhood memories that surfaced unexpectedly. Daniel once told me he used to tutor to pay rent, but stayed because he liked helping people find confidence in themselves. "You do that," I said before I could stop myself. "Do what?" "Help people believe they're not stupid." He looked at me, then really looked at me, and for a second, the air shifted. Not dramatically, just enough for my stomach to tighten. His gaze lingered longer than necessary before he smiled and looked away. That happened more often than I was comfortable with. Those pauses. Those moments where words seemed optional. The complication came quietly, disguised as responsibility. Halfway through the semester, Daniel told me he'd been offered a short-term research position outside the city. It wasn't permanent, he explained, just a few weeks, but it would mean fewer sessions. Maybe none at all if my schedule didn't align. "I can find someone else for you," he said carefully, like he was offering a solution instead of a loss. The idea hit harder than it should have. My throat tightened, and I hated myself for it. "It's fine," I said too quickly. "I'll manage." Daniel studied my face, his expression unreadable. "You sure?" I nodded, focusing on my notes. I told myself the discomfort was about academics, about routine, about fear of falling behind, not about him. But after that, everything felt slightly off. We were both more aware of time, of deadlines, of the fact that something was ending even temporarily. Our conversations grew softer, more deliberate. Touches, accidental before, started to feel charged. When he handed me a pen and our fingers brushed, I felt it everywhere. One evening, while we reviewed practice problems, Daniel leaned closer than usual to look at my work. His shoulder pressed against mine, steady and warm. He didn't move away right away. Neither did I. I was painfully aware of my breathing, of the way my body seemed to tilt toward him without my permission. "You're doing better than you think," he murmured. I looked up, and our faces were closer than they'd ever been. For a heartbeat, neither of us spoke. His eyes flicked briefly to my mouth before he straightened, clearing his throat as if nothing had happened. I stared back at my notes, my pulse loud in my ears. That night, after I left, I replayed everything. The look, the silence, the almost. I wondered if he felt it too, or if I was projecting meaning onto kindness. Daniel was attentive by nature, encouraging, warm. Those traits didn't belong to me. Still, something had changed. We started walking together after sessions, even when it wasn't necessary. Our paths diverged halfway down the block, but we stretched the time anyway, talking slower, laughing more. Sometimes our arms brushed as we walked, and neither of us adjusted. I told myself it was harmless, that I was imagining depth where there was only comfort. But comfort doesn't make you lie awake at night wondering what someone is thinking when they look at you like that. And it doesn't make the thought of losing weekly study sessions feel like the beginning of missing something much bigger than help with an exam. Whatever we were becoming, it wasn't something I could label yet. All I knew was that Daniel had stopped being a part of my schedule, and had quietly become a part of me. The week Daniel was supposed to leave for his research assignment, Everything unraveled in a way I hadn't prepared for. It started innocently enough. One last extended study session, he'd said. A kind of wrap-up. Let's go somewhere quiet, he suggested. No distractions. We'll make sure you're solid before finals. I agreed too quickly. The place he chose was a small academic archive on the edge of campus. Rarely used, almost forgotten. It wasn't dramatic or romantic. Just rows of shelves, narrow tables, and thick walls that muted the outside world. The kind of place meant for focus. The kind of place where silence pressed close. We were shown into a private study room barely larger than a storage office. One table, 2 chairs, a single lamp casting a soft pool of light. When the door closed behind us, the quiet felt heavier than usual, like the space itself was holding its breath. "This okay?" Daniel asked. "Yeah," I said, though my voice came out rougher than intended. We sat closer than we normally would. There simply wasn't another option. Our knees nearly touched beneath the table. I tried to angle myself away subtly, but every movement seemed to bring me closer instead. The air smelled faintly of old paper and the familiar citrus note of his cologne, and it did something unhelpful to my concentration. For the first hour, we managed to keep things normal. We reviewed problems. He explained concepts with the same patience he always had. But my awareness of him never dimmed. Every time he leaned forward, every time his arm brushed mine as he reached for a book, my thoughts fractured. I wanted to tell myself this was just nerves, that proximity did strange things to the brain. But I knew better. At one point, I dropped my pen. It rolled beneath the table, closer to his side. Without thinking, we both leaned down to grab it at the same time. Our heads nearly collided. We froze, faces inches apart, breath shared in that tight space. "Sorry," we said together. He laughed softly, then hesitated, as if unsure whether to move away. His hand lingered near mine, fingers brushing my knuckles just long enough to feel intentional. When he finally straightened, my chest felt tight, like I'd missed a step on a staircase. "You okay?" he asked, watching me carefully. "Yeah," I lied. "Just tired." He didn't look convinced. As the afternoon wore on, the tension didn't fade. It sharpened. Daniel grew quieter, more deliberate. When he spoke, his voice was lower, steadier. He stopped leaning back in his chair and stayed forward instead, elbows on the table, body angled toward mine. At some point, the academic focus cracked. "You've changed," he said suddenly. I looked up. "What?" He shrugged, then shook his head like he hadn't meant to say it aloud. "You're more confident. You don't second-guess yourself as much." "That's because you trained the panic out of me?" I said, trying to joke. He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Maybe. Or maybe you always had it." The way he said it, like it mattered, made something twist painfully inside me. I wanted to say you did that. I wanted to say you make me feel capable. Instead, I looked down at my notes and pretended to read. Silence stretched between us. I could feel him watching me. Not the casual attention of a tutor checking progress, but something heavier, more personal. My pulse thudded loudly in my ears. "Daniel," I said before I could stop myself. He met my eyes immediately. "Yeah." There were a dozen things I could have said. Questions. Safe observations. Anything academic. Instead, nothing came out. The words lodged in my throat, tangled with fear. Fear of misreading him. Fear of ruining what we had. Fear that if I reached for more, I'd lose him entirely. He seemed to sense the struggle. He didn't push, didn't fill the silence. He just waited, hands folded loosely on the table, posture open in a way that felt like an invitation and a warning all at once. After a moment, he reached out and gently nudged my notebook toward me. "You don't need to be perfect," he said quietly. "You never did." Something about that, about the softness in his voice, the closeness of his hand to mine, made my defenses falter. I nodded, unable to trust my voice. The room felt smaller then, or maybe I was just more aware of it. The narrow distance between our shoulders. The fact that if I shifted even slightly, we'd be touching fully. When he stood to grab another book from the shelf behind me, The movement forced him closer. His thigh brushed my arm. His hand rested briefly on the back of my chair as he leaned past me. It was such a small thing. Casual. Probably unintentional. My body reacted like it wasn't. I hated myself for it. For how much I wanted him to stay there. For how my thoughts betrayed me, imagining what it would feel like if he didn't move away. When he returned to his seat, he didn't pull back as far as before. His knee pressed lightly against mine under the table. This time, neither of us shifted. "About the research trip," he said, voice careful. I didn't realize how complicated it would feel. My heart skipped. Complicated how? He exhaled slowly. Leaving. Stepping away from this. From us, my mind supplied, even though he hadn't said it. I forced myself to stay grounded. It's just a few weeks. I know. His gaze didn't waver. But some things change when you stop seeing them every week. The honesty in his words scared me more than silence ever had. I felt exposed, like he was standing too close to something fragile inside me. "I don't want to lose this," I admitted before I could retreat. Daniel's breath caught. I saw it. His fingers flexed slightly against the tabletop, knuckles whitening for just a second. "Neither do I," he said. The weight of that moment settled between us. Not a confession, but something dangerously close. The kind of truth that demanded a response, even if it wasn't spoken. We sat there, knees touching, eyes locked, the room holding our secrets. I wanted to reach out, to close the distance, to know once and for all whether the pull I felt lived in him too. But fear held me back. Because if I was wrong, if this was all just proximity and projection, I'd lose the one person who made me feel seen in a way I never had before. Daniel seemed to sense that too. He didn't move closer, didn't retreat. He stayed right there in the uncertainty with me, letting the tension exist without forcing it. And somehow that was the most intimate thing we'd shared yet. We didn't finish studying. That realization came slowly, like everything else between us. The books were still open, notes half-marked, a problem left unfinished on the page between us. But neither of us looked at it anymore. Time had stretched into something unfamiliar, thick with everything we weren't saying. The silence wasn't awkward. It was heavy, charged. Daniel shifted first, leaning back slightly as if he needed air. He ran a hand through his hair, then rested his elbow on the table, his fingers pressing against his temple. "I should probably wrap this up," he said, but there was no conviction in his voice. I nodded, even though my body resisted the idea. "Yeah, you've helped a lot." That wasn't what I wanted to say. Felt too small, too polite, like thanking someone for directions when they'd actually changed your sense of where you were going. He started gathering the books, stacking them more carefully than necessary. I watched his hands, steady, practiced, while my own stayed frozen in my lap. My chest felt tight, like something inside me was pacing, waiting for a door to open. "I'll email you the last few resources," he added, "just in case." "Okay." Another silence. Another missed exit. Daniel stopped mid-motion. Slowly, he looked up at me, not with his usual easy calm, but with something rawer, exposed. "Can I ask you something?" he said. My stomach dropped. "Yeah." He hesitated, clearly choosing his words. "Do you ever feel like you're holding back? Even when you don't want to be?" The question landed harder than he probably intended. I swallowed, my pulse loud in my ears. "All the time," I admitted. His gaze softened. "Why?" "Because I was afraid of this exact moment. Because I didn't know how to survive wanting something I couldn't afford to lose." "I've always been careful," I said slowly. "I plan things. I don't take risks without understanding the outcome." Daniel nodded like he understood that deeply. "And what happens when you don't understand it?" I laughed weakly. "I freeze." Something shifted in his expression then. Recognition. Maybe even relief. "Me too," he said quietly. The air between us felt suddenly fragile, like one wrong move could shatter everything. I wanted to retreat, to make a joke, to close the books and pretend this was just another tutoring session ending like all the others. But the thought of him leaving, of weeks without this space, without him, pressed against my chest until it hurt. "Daniel," I said, my voice barely steady. "When you said you didn't want to lose this, what did you mean?" He inhaled sharply, then let the breath out slowly. "I meant that this stopped feeling like tutoring a long time ago." My heart skipped. "Then what did it feel like?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood and moved toward the window, resting his hands on the sill. His back was to me, shoulders tense. "It felt like something I wasn't supposed to want," he said. "Something I told myself not to name." My mouth went dry. I stood too, the chair scraping softly against the floor. I stayed where I was, afraid to get closer and afraid not to. "I thought it was one-sided," he continued, "or that I was projecting. You're my student. I didn't want to cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed." I took a step forward without realizing it. "You didn't." He turned then, meeting my eyes. The distance between us felt electric. "You don't look at someone the way you look at me if it's nothing," he said, voice steady but low. "And I don't notice every shift in your mood, every hesitation, if it's just professional." My chest ached with the weight of it, the truth we'd been circling finally spoken aloud. "I tried to convince myself it was admiration," I said, "that I just respected you, that I liked feeling supported." "And now?" he asked gently. "And now," I said, my voice breaking slightly, "I think about you when I shouldn't. I replay conversations. I notice things that don't matter if this is just tutoring." Daniel closed his eyes briefly, like he was absorbing the impact. When he opened them again, there was no doubt in his gaze, only vulnerability. "I was scared," he admitted. "Scared that if I said something, I'd make you uncomfortable. Or worse, lose you completely. I was scared you'd tell me it was all in my head," I confessed. A small, almost sad smile crossed his face. "Funny how we protected each other by staying silent." The space between us felt unbearable then. Not because it was crowded, but because it was still there. Daniel took a careful step toward me. Slow, deliberate, giving me time to stop him. I didn't. "I don't know what happens after this," he said. "I don't know how we navigate it. But I do know I don't want to keep pretending I don't feel this." My throat tightened. "Neither do I." He lifted his hand, hesitated for a heartbeat, then gently rested it against my wrist. The touch was light, questioning. When I didn't pull away, his fingers curled slightly, warm and grounding. The sensation traveled through me, sharp and grounding all at once. "Is this okay?" he asked quietly. "Yes," I breathed. "It is." That was all the permission he needed. He stepped closer, not rushed, not urgent. Just close enough that I could feel his warmth, his breath. His other hand came up, resting at my waist, careful and respectful, as if he was memorizing the moment. I looked up at him, my heart pounding. "I don't want this to be a mistake." "It won't be," he said softly. "Not if we're honest." His thumb brushed lightly against my wrist, sending a shiver through me. "I've wanted to do this," he admitted. "But only if you were sure." I nodded, my voice failing me. The kiss wasn't dramatic. No rush, no urgency, just a gentle meeting of lips, tentative questioning. He paused immediately after, forehead resting against mine, giving me space to pull away if I needed to. I didn't. I leaned in instead, my hands finding his arms, holding on to him like something steady. The second kiss was warmer, more certain, still careful but real. When we finally pulled back, we stayed close, breathing the same air. His forehead rested against mine, his hands steady at my waist. "Whatever happens next," he said quietly, "I want to face it with you." I smiled, soft, overwhelmed, relieved. Me too. In that small, quiet room, surrounded by unfinished notes and unspoken fears, everything changed. Not because we rushed forward, but because we finally stopped holding back. And for the first time, the future didn't feel like something to plan. Felt like something to choose. After the kiss, nothing snapped back into place the way I expected. There was no rush to explain ourselves, no immediate plan. Instead, there was a quiet, lighter than before, almost tender. The kind of quiet that comes after a truth has been spoken and allowed to stay. Daniel was the first to laugh, soft and disbelieving. "Well," he said, exhaling slowly, "that definitely wasn't in the syllabus." I smiled, the tension in my shoulders finally easing. "You always said the best lessons weren't planned." He shook his head, eyes warm. "You're impossible. And you still like me?" I said, testing the words. "I do," he replied without hesitation, saying it like it was the simplest fact in the room. We gathered our things eventually, though slower than usual. Everything felt different now, lighter but also more deliberate. When we walked out of the archive, our hands brushed, and this time neither of us pretended it was accidental. His fingers slid naturally into mine, confident but gentle, like he'd been waiting to do that for a while. Outside, the air felt clearer. Not dramatic, just honest. We didn't talk much as we walked. We didn't need to. Every few steps, he squeezed my hand slightly, as if reminding both of us that this was real. Back at his apartment, the familiarity felt new again. We kicked off our shoes, set our bags down, and stood there awkwardly for a moment, smiling like we didn't quite know what to do with ourselves. "So," I said, "what happens now?" Daniel leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "I was hoping you'd tell me." I laughed. "Figures. You're the tutor." "Former tutor," he corrected gently. "That part matters." It did. We talked about it then, really talked. About boundaries. About timing. About how neither of us wanted to rush into something just because the door had finally opened. Daniel admitted he'd worried about the power dynamic, about whether my feelings were influenced by gratitude or proximity. "And?" I asked. "And," he said, stepping closer, "you're standing here asking what happens next. That doesn't feel confused to me." We ordered food, something easy we could eat on the couch. Halfway through the meal, I realized my leg was draped over his without either of us noticing. When I pointed it out, he smiled and said, "You gonna move it?" I didn't. Later, we talked about everything and nothing. He told me about the research project in more detail, what excited him, what scared him. I admitted I was afraid of being the person who waited his whole life to feel chosen. "You are chosen," he said quietly. "Right now." The words settled deep in my chest. It grew late without us realizing it. At some point, he asked if I wanted to stay. Not loaded. Not assumed. Just open. "I do," I said. We didn't rush. We brushed our teeth side by side, bumping shoulders, smiling at our reflections like we were sharing a secret. When we finally lay down, the space between us felt deliberate, not uncertain. His arm rested around my waist, grounding. I lay there listening to his breathing, aware of how safe I felt. "You okay?" he murmured. "More than okay," I said. Sleep came easily, the kind that arrives when your mind finally stops rehearsing worst-case scenarios. I woke once in the middle of the night to find his hand still there, warm and steady. I didn't move it. I didn't need to. In the morning, light spilled across the room, soft and unhurried. Daniel was awake, watching me with a small smile. "That look is unfair before coffee," I said. He laughed. "You drool when you sleep." "I absolutely do not." "Academic debate," he teased. "We'll need evidence." We lay there a while longer talking about practical things, about how we'd explain this to the tutoring office, about taking things slow while still being honest, about the fact that his research trip was still happening, and that distance would be new territory. "I don't want to pretend it won't be hard," he said, "but I also don't want to let fear decide for us." I nodded. "Neither do I." When we finally got up, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning that had been waiting patiently for us to notice. As we stood in the kitchen, sharing coffee and quiet smiles, I realized something important. The lesson he'd given me wasn't about economics or exams. It was about choosing presence over hesitation. And this time, I wasn't studying anymore. I was living it. The weeks after that morning didn't unfold the way I used to imagine the future would. There were no dramatic declarations, no sudden certainty that erased every doubt. Instead, there was something better, steadier. Real. Daniel left for his research trip 3 days later. I won't pretend it was easy. Standing with him at the station, his bag slung over his shoulder, I felt the familiar urge to brace myself for disappointment. Old habits don't disappear overnight. But this time, when our fingers intertwined, he didn't let go first. "This isn't goodbye," he said, like he knew exactly where my thoughts were going. "I know," I replied, and for once I actually believed it. We made a quiet promise then. Not dramatic, not spoken aloud in full sentences. Just an understanding. We would stay connected. We would be honest. We would give this space to grow instead of suffocating it with fear. The days apart taught me something unexpected. Missing him didn't feel like panic. It felt like anticipation. Late-night messages about his work. Voice notes where he teased me for mispronouncing technical terms he wasn't even teaching me anymore. Photos of his coffee, his notes, a street he liked walking down. Little pieces of his life offered freely. And when he came back, it didn't feel like picking up where we left off. Felt like stepping forward. We fell into a rhythm that belonged only to us. Study sessions became shared dinners. Walks stretched longer than planned. Silence stopped feeling like something to fill and became something we chose. We learned each other in quiet ways, how he liked his eggs, how I needed time to think before talking, how we both got stubborn in different directions. One afternoon, weeks later, we found ourselves back at the same library where everything had started. Not to study, just to sit. The same tall windows. The same filtered light. "Funny," Daniel said, glancing around. "This place feels smaller now. Or we're just less afraid of it," I replied. He smiled at that, then reached for my hand under the table. No hesitation. No second-guessing. That simple act, fingers fitting together like they belonged, meant more than any promise I'd ever made in my head. We talked about the future, carefully but honestly. About where his work might take him. About what I wanted beyond exams and expectations. We didn't solve everything. We didn't need to. "What matters," he said, squeezing my hand, "is that we don't stop choosing this." I nodded. "Even when it's inconvenient?" "Especially then." That night, as we walked back to his place, he bumped his shoulder into mine playfully. "You know," he said, "you still owe me for all those tutoring hours." I laughed. "I passed the course. That's payment." "Hardly," he said, grinning. "I'm thinking long-term repayment." I raised an eyebrow. "Dangerous language." "Intentional language," he corrected. Later, lying beside him, listening to the familiar rhythm of his breathing, I thought about how much had changed without forcing itself. How love, real love, hadn't arrived as a lightning strike, but as a steady accumulation of choices. He shifted closer in his sleep, his arm finding its place around me. I rested my hand over his, our fingers tangling instinctively. That small gesture felt like a vow. Not to perfection, not to certainty, but to presence. In the morning, as sunlight filled the room, Daniel opened his eyes and smiled at me like there was nowhere else he needed to be. "Stay," he said, not as a request, but as an invitation. "I am," I replied, and for the first time in my life, the future didn't feel like something I had to control or predict. It felt like a path unfolding beside someone willing to walk it with me. Step by step, lesson by lesson. I went to study, but what I learned was how to stop holding back. And this, whatever we were becoming, was only the beginning.